because she was a young mother, and in part because I wanted it to be a little more feminine. Readers of that series wouldn't have noticed it because it wasn't until what would have been issue 5 that the father T-Rex turned up, and then it would have been more evident that I was giving the male Tyrannosaurus Rexes, I guess what we'd call bigger bones, a big bone fellow. So I do think about that when I'm drawing. But in the case of a solo lake monster, I'm not going to worry about it. This could be a he or a she. But that's a good question, because if it's a she, then there's got to be a he around if there's more than one lake man from Agog monster. There we go. Okay, so you can see how, I mean, I'm not going to do much more detail on that body at this point. You know, once I get in with the pen, I'm probably going to do a little more around this part of the body by the water. But you can already see that as I lay in more scale patterns, the opportunity for screwing up becomes greater. So I'm going to stop with that at this point, because it does look round enough to me, and it does have the feeling of, you know, the kind of weight that a large snake like a python or a boa constrictor has. You know, they aren't perfectly round tubes that stay that way. If you've ever had one as a pet, or a friend of yours had one and you were able to handle one, you know, wherever their weighty part of their body is around your arm, it lays flatter, and, you know, when it's away from what it's holding on to, it becomes more cylindrical, and that's what I wanted to capture here. What I will do, though, is put a little more detail of scale pattern on this part of the body over here that's popping up out of the water. And again, I got to be careful. Too much can really screw things up. Not enough, and it will start to look like one of those sausage-like creatures that pop up in Marvel Comics, Conan comics, where they look like they've come out of a meatpacking plant, and there's no skeleton under there. Okay, now I'm going to put a little bit more time into this lakeshore, and this is a delicate point in the drawing. I want to put enough detail that it looks believable to you and has a sense of place and environment, but I really don't want to distract from that face. Part of what is pulling your eye to that face is this design, and the fact that I've got the diagonals that stop your eye from going further than the face. But part of it is, if I begin to put too much detail anywhere else in the drawing, that will cease to be a center of attention. Also notice I've got the eye directed in such a way that, as a bird or reptile will, it's sort of cocked its head so it's looking at you. It's harder to get eye contact with the reader with a non-mammal form, and that's why so many creatures tend to be anthropomorphized in comics or by illustrators, is that they're trying to get that sense of eye contact. But eye contact with a bird or a reptile is very much unlike eye contact with a person or a cat or a dog. If you really look at their eyes, they don't think the way we do. They're not looking at us the way we're looking at them. And you know, it's a whole different reality for them. And I try to capture that when I'm doing reptile or bird forms. Okay, that's about as much detail as I'm going to put there. So, one of the ways of not worrying about too much detail is I'm going to put another arrow to bring you down to this creature, and that is the shadow from this tree. You can see I'm really banging it in pretty loose, because any application of ink will look like the edge of a rock, and that's okay at this stage. There, that helps pull this drawing together quite a bit. And now it creates almost a frame for what I want you really looking at, which is this critter's face. That means I've also got to give a little bit of care with what I do back here. Okay, and that works pretty well for me. And I'm going to suggest increasingly flattened shale-like rock back here. And I'm not going to worry about being too specific with vegetative forms. I don't care whether this is grass or ferns or what up here. Ferns are really fun to draw, especially with brush, but fern textures would pull your eye away from the creature, and I don't want that. Okay, now put a little more detail in the rocks that are on this side of him. And in doing that, I'm also going to delineate a little bit more of reflective surfaces. Now, one of the things about drawing water as a cartoonist rather than as a painter, if I were doing this as a watercolorist or oil or acrylic paint, I would approach doing this water completely differently. But I'm not. I'm working with brush, pen, and ink, so I'm drawing this as a cartoonist. This means that there are abstract forms that over the years I've seen in other artists' work or that I've stumbled into my own that suggest to me water. And I'm going to use those things, and I can't necessarily give you a justification for them. And one of them are these kind of odd circular shapes, which suggest water patterns. They work best if I were working on a slick paper surface. With a watercolor and tooth surface, I'm not getting quite the smooth edge of the form that I would prefer. But it sort of suggests something drifting on the surface or something reflecting on the surface. It doesn't matter what it really is, because it really isn't anything. It's just marks on paper. And I'm trying to put them in such a way that everything now is creating a pattern just like this. Okay, so I'm now focusing on a strong horizontal, because this, I don't want to create any strong verticals, because then it's going to disrupt that being the center of attention, the creature's face. Okay. Does anyone have a G-nib I can use? Thank you. And is it broken in? Oh, it is. Perfect. Okay, this is a G-nib pen tip, beloved of CCSers here at the Center for Cartoon Studies. And the reason I like this pen point is, if you can see it closely, it is a large sort of crow quill cartooning point, and as you'll see as I begin working with it, it's very flexible. It's not as flexible as a brush, but I've got a lot of play with the line, and I've got a lot of control over the line. I'm not putting much weight on this one. If this were my G-nib, I would beat the tar out of it, but because it's matched G-nib, I'm going to treat it with tender love. Okay, what I'm doing now is I'm emphasizing the curve of this creature's body, and I'm going to go in and add a little bit more line information to catch how that curve works. But not too much, because again, I could really easily screw up with one or two pen lines that were out of place. That's just about right. Now, because this guy is just slithering out of the water, I also want to put what suggests some ripple effects. Now, if I were working with gray tones like a wash or with watercolor, I would do this by laying in a tone and then putting some white there. But because I'm not doing that, because it's a line drawing at this point, I'm going to use the pen nib to suggest some reflective light on the edge of the form. And you always got to have a little drip coming from your sea monster's mouth. I don't know why, but you have to. Okay, and now working with this G-nib, I'm going to catch a little bit more facial detail. I want to suggest the scale patterns around the mouth without being too specific about it. The finest scales on any reptilian creature's face are around the eyes. Those are the finest scales. So it's important to suggest that kind of very small